Okay. So this is going to be a little bit of a different stream from what I normally do. This is a much shorter uh, format. My shortest stream to date, I think, has been about an hour and a half. I doubt that this one will even reach an hour. It's probably going to be closer to half an hour, 45 minutes maybe, depending on how much mileage I can get out of what I have here. But as you can see, I have open here the three patents that were recently leaked, I guess, in a sense, that do seem to pertain to the sequel to Breath of the Wild. Now, from what I can see here, this one is most obviously the phasing through terrain ability. Even just from looking at this initial diagram, you can sort of get that impression without sort of going any further into the bits and pieces. So just taking this one image into consideration alone, it's already a little bit to be excited about, because it gives us potentially some insights into how this new mechanic will work. The description goes a little further in terms of sort of describing how the mechanic functions. This particular overview, I guess, is quite technical in terms of how it's laid out and the specific language used. So there are obviously, like, there's a in terms of the actual body of the text, there's a goodly amount to read on each of these, and sort of explaining how it could potentially function. So let me see here. Let's have a quick look at the diagrams, the drawings first, because this is going to give us sort of the clearest look at it. So obviously this is the first one, and this seems to be showing basically what lower surfaces the game will consider valid for the phase through process. So this first one, it's demonstrating a particular angle here and here. In these first two, it's demonstrating a particular angle, and if it's greater than a certain angle, it won't consider it valid. So this would be valid because it looks like it's less than, I want to say, I mean, it's definitely less than 45 degrees. This one's sort of closer to 70, 75 degrees maybe. And this one is obviously such a steep angle. Like, it checks a range of width from the look of it to perform this calculation in as well. So if it sends up two rays either side and detects a significant difference within that, it's obviously not going to proceed. The next lot are basically just the switch system, because it directly pertains to it, and it also lists the internal processing and so forth for that. So let's continue on to this one here. So we have passing through movement is not possible if no terrain object is present above. Obviously, there's nothing to pass through. You can't use the ability. So movable upward under certain condition. That's the first condition check as described here. Moving through the terrain object and then moving on to the terrain object. Obviously, well, not necessarily obviously, but we have some kind of indication there of how that will work. Now, it doesn't show down, it only shows up, which is very, very interesting. So if this is going to tie into the underground exploration, well, at least in this particular drawing, it doesn't show down. We could see something like that in the text going forward. I don't know. We'll have a look at that, as I said, after I've had a look at these, but it doesn't seem to indicate that we can go down using this ability, only upwards. So again, looking at this as well, we can see this very interesting condition check. we have a predetermined height distance, so a maximum height through which we can enter the terrain object that we're trying to cross through. So this predetermined distance, I'm assuming, isn't going to be very large for the most part. This makes me think that the ability as used, for general exploration, so for getting around the overworld, for getting through dungeons, will only work within this distance. But I'm assuming, much like, say, for example, the implementation of the shock jump pad in Banjo-Kazooie, Banjo-Tooie, you will have the ability at certain locations to bypass that limit. I think that's what we may have been seeing in that initial little image. Either it could be that, or that could also just be getting the ability in the first place. Hard to say for sure, but it does speak to that possibility. Either that, or we're going to have to sort of climb up ascending steps of islands, and in fact we may unlock those over time as routes up into the sky. So then looking at this as well, this is describing, I'm assuming, the actual space, the check space for the ability. We'll have to go back and check that against the figure there. I may have to open some of these in new tabs so that we can go back and forth. But so again, we see this check, which is repeated for some reason. We see that if a significant portion of this column is outside of a flat piece, like if this is the edge of a platform and Link is not far enough underneath the platform, it will not allow you to head upwards. Likewise, if there is, what I'm assuming this is like any kind of damaging surface in the way, or perhaps any kind of prohibitive surface in the way, it won't let you pass through. And then we also have this for the receiving surface, that it has to be, again, within a certain range of safety. It won't allow you to go onto particularly angled surfaces, nor will it allow you to enter into surfaces that are too small for Link to enter into, which makes sense to have that check in place, because otherwise it would make glitching through these very, very easy. I imagine there'll be some kind of variable defined in Link's AI for that. This one here is also very, very interesting, because it also doesn't necessarily, again, in the image, it may relate in the text, but it doesn't relate in the image whether or not for each pass through the distance gets reset. So whether it checks once for height here, checks for height here again to see if we can continue passing through, and then places you on the top, or whether it's going to take this total distance into account. But we can see that there's an intermediate space where there is enough room for the player, but it's not a suitable location. So it moves upward to the next available one that is suitable. Very, very interesting. This one does not relay a great deal here. It's also flipped on its side. So I'll have to come back to this one at a later time. I suspect, based on the fact that this is a grid, this may be to do with the way the terrain positioning, the way the terrain works, but we shall see. Again, this one is also similarly unclear without the text, so and we'll also have to have a look at this one too. I'm assuming this relates to the movement of the camera. It's possible that what we're seeing here is basically a blanking plane, so that as the camera passes through the object, we don't sort of see through to the inside of the object. So when the camera enters through, it'll just go black or something, or have some kind of texture to indicate the passage through that, blocking the view of the rest of the terrain. Then we have some data flow related stuff. So this is obviously what it affects in terms of, I suppose, the entities at play. And then we have some actual flow charts here that basically tell us how the game calculates the passing through movement. And then there's the actual process itself. So we basically have this links up to this separate flow chart here. And presumably, again, it can potentially loop through the whole thing multiple times. So this does make me think that there's a possibility that... Where was it? No, not that one. The next one. This one here. It may run that process multiple times to check. And so we'll go beep, nope, beep, and appear at the top. So let's have a look again at the description here. So here we go. Although the player can be made to jump high, if a terrain object is present above the player character, it's not possible to move the player character to the upper side of the object. Therefore, the present application discloses a storage, medium, information process apparatus, and information processing system, and a game processing method, which are capable of, when a terrain object is present above a player character, moving the player character to an upper side of the terrain object. So, according to the configuration of the above, when the terrain object is located above the player character can be moved to the upper side of the terrain object. In the special movement control, if it is further satisfied that the terrain object serving as a ceiling is present within a predetermined distance upward from the player character, the game program may cause the processor to execute performing a control of moving the player character to the destination based on the operation input performed by the player. So it's on command. It's by input of some description. If the terrain object serving as a ceiling is far distant, it is possible to reduce the possibility that the player character is moved. Special movement control may cause the processor to execute. According to the configuration of the above, it is possible to allow the player to intuitively recognize that the player character passes through the terrain object and moving to the current position. When moving the player to game may cause the processor to execute displaying different animations. Okay, yeah. So that's basically the entrance and exit from the terrain object. It's fairly clear. Determination of shape may be at least one of a shape defined by one or more line segments extending upwards, a polygonal column shape, and a cylindrical shape. Determination shape facilitates the determination. Determination as to whether or not a terrain object serving as a ceiling is present within the predetermined distance upward from the player may be performed based on the size of a part of the determination shape which is in contact with the surface of the terrain object. So yeah, there we go. So basically, there will be probably an invisible object that does a collision check to see how much of it intersects with the geometry. Let's see here. Yeah, there we go. Figure 10 shows an example of raise. I think that's the one we were looking at. Let me just open this in a new tab. So go... Yeah, here we go. Figure 10. Oh, did we go back to the start again? No, here we go. Yeah, an example of rays set around the player character. So, okay, so it's ray casting then. Now I did want to have a look. Figure 16 shows an example of a game image in a state before a movement item becomes usable. This shows an example of a game image that is displayed in response to an item designated. Hang on. Oh. I see. Right. So this one is showing the targeting reticle of some description and indicating that when you can't phase through, it'll show you no unfilled ring, probably like a red ring or something, and then this will be your go ring. So that makes sense. Let's see here. And then placement of character and virtual camera. So we'd want to have a bit more of a look at this one because this... I want to see what this marked 312 plane is because I suspect... 312... During passing through movement, virtual camera 311 may be placed inside the terrain object 212. In this case, the game system 1 places a background object 312 behind the player character 201 as seen from the virtual camera. In the exemplary embodiment, the background object has a size that can cover the field of view of the virtual camera and is placed at a position as to cover the field of view of the virtual camera, i.e. so the terrain object behind the background object is not displayed. Therefore, in this case, the player character and background object and the player displayed on the display, while the terrain object, strictly speaking, a polygon on the surface of the terrain object is not displayed. Texture rendered on the background object is arbitrary. For example, an image representing a scene in which a player character moves underground. Oh, moves underground. Interesting. Or an image representing a scene in which a player character moves by space warp is rendered on the background object. Okay, so it's going to place maybe a movie, perhaps. Okay, yeah, and here we go. As described above in the exemplary embodiment, during the passing through movement, the background object is displayed if the virtual camera is placed inside the terrain object. Thus, it is possible to avoid inconvenience that may occur if the display process is performed from a viewpoint on the backside, in other words, from the inside of the polygon of the terrain object. For example, the backside of the polygon is not rendered in many cases, which may cause a problem that the terrain object is partially displayed or not displayed, thereby the appearance thereof is deformed. Even if the backside of the polygon is rendered, the appearance is still unnatural because the backside of the object is not usually displayed. Okay, yeah, so basically it's going to show something to cover the transition, so we can't cheat, probably, or see things that we're not supposed to see at that particular moment in time, which is, I mean, that is definitely to be expected. Like, this kind of thing I would most certainly expect to see, so that's quite unsurprising. So stepping back a bit here, excuse me, becomes able to use the movement item. Specific operation method is performing item designation instruction is arbitrary. Game changes position or orientation of the virtual camera, so it'll be direct upwards from the position. Okay, so it just points directly up from where you're standing, I guess. State shown. Train object serving as a ceiling is present. Virtual camera instructed upward. Marker is placed above the player character, which is in position. Okay, yeah. So again, we basically have some kind of indicator that you can or cannot move through the terrain. So that makes sense. And again, movement conditions, ceiling conditions. This is all fairly straightforward. Now. Okay, so yeah, in the above, yeah, so thus, according to exemplary embodiment, it's possible to provide a novel method for moving the player character in the game space. So this is basically the justification, I think, for this particular pattern, i.e. it provides a novel way of getting around the terrain. I can't recall any other games that have done this exact thing off the top of my head, so there may be a genuine... it may be genuinely viable that this could be kept as a patent. Let me see. Okay, yeah, and here we go. Alternative, so another embodiment, the height condition regarding the height from the player character to the ceiling may not necessarily be set as a ceiling condition included in the movement condition. That is, if there is no place to be excluded, such as the place far above in the game, a height limit need not be set. Alternatively, the height limit in the height condition may be set to an infinite or sufficient height, which means that there is substantially no height limit. So, theoretically then, we could see specific locations where we can use this ability to a greater extent, or we can potentially upgrade it at a later time, or possibly both. Let's see here. Game system may display an image showing the game space around the destination before the player performs the movement start instruction. That makes a lot of sense. We may even potentially see a camera view superimposed of the distant side, which, given that it seems to be sort of a water-based thing, would make a lot of sense if it's like a mirror or what have you. That would certainly make sense. I'm not seeing. Let's try. Which face downwards? That's just the ray casting, or rather the normals of it. Set at the feet of the player. Lower into the play character's interaction. In another embodiment, the positions of the start points with respect to the up-down direction may be set at the position of the head of the player character. So that's also very interesting. Okay, so there's not much mention of phasing down through things, but still very, very interesting. Okay, so this one here, abstract movement, related parameters using virtual physical calculation, blah, 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 blah. Based on operation input is caused to perform return movement to return to previously recorded positions and orientations sequentially backward from the time of giving a start instruction based on the operation input. So I'll be very, very interested to see more of this one. So let's open drawings in a new tab again, because that seems to make the most sense. So we've got a lot less in terms of diagrams for this one, but they are still quite detailed, at least. So we have objects on the screen there, and we see the end position. We see that we target, we send it back, and that there is a meter to determine the maximum threshold of time. Whether that's a visible or invisible meter remains to be seen. So we've got various programs, operation data, previous arrangement data, designated object data, target data, movement parameter data. So it's probably going to keep a lot of this. I imagine it will probably be attached, assuming that they're reusing the Havoc physics engine for this. I'm assuming that for all objects at rest, the game will probably keep won't bother keeping this data, but as soon as an object starts to move that this ability can be used on, it will start tracking that data. And pass this by that. All makes a lot of sense. So start, initial setting, obtain operation data, player character movement process, object movement process, record arrangement information, return movement, no, display control process, end of game, return movement process, which is then defined here. Is return movement flag on, no, display objects to be caused. Display objects to be caused to perform return movement differently, set cursor, position of object to be caused return movement, no. Okay, so we're checking whether or not it's moved, I think. Start of return movement, no, yes, determine, return, set target, movement parameters, disappearance, interesting. So there's a lot to unpack here as well. So let's go back to here and we'll have a quick look at the description, because this is probably going to be a lot more illuminating in this particular case. In such game programs, an object is moved in virtual space, a reverse motion of the object returning to its previous state before the movement cannot be utilized. I'm trying to think of outside of pre-scripted movement, whether there are any games that do keep track of any number of objects that are moving so as to be able to reverse them, but moving from a dynamic perspective. Because obviously if you're just scrubbing a timeline of location data, it's a little bit different, I think, to what's being described here, because this is something that's dynamic and is not specifically pre-programmed. Let's see. An unlimited example of a non-transitory computer read, blah, 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 blah. The game program causes computer to controlling player character in a virtual space, recording positions and orientations of objects in a range in the virtual space of memory at time intervals, so that the positions and orientations are stored in chronological order in the memory, changing movement-related parameters and used in virtual physical calculation, such as a designated object of the object which is selected based on the operation input is caused to perform return movement to return it to the previous positions and orientations stored in memory, sequentially backward from the time of it giving a start instruction based on the operation input and updating a state in the virtual space, including the player character, the designated object, and other objects based on the physical calculations. So, it's basically saying here that the game is going to snapshot any... potentially saying that it's going to basically snapshot the objects that are around the player character that have movement data and just store a bunch of slices of it, which is very, very interesting. And I'm wondering how well that would work in terms of... I'm assuming it's code for this is going to be ridiculously optimized, which, if it ever gets reverse engineered, is going to make an absolute bear potentially. But anyway, let's continue here. The game program may cause the computer to further execute response. In response to the completion of the return movement of the designated object to the position or orientation recorded into memory the first period of time before. Okay, so basically, if you use it immediately after something starts moving, and there's very little movement data, obviously it's just going to go back a certain distance, which makes me wonder whether the recharge / cooldown for that's going to determine, how that works. So you'd use it once, and then there'd be a certain amount of cooldown based on how much time you shifted. Positions and orientations corresponding to the first period of time. So let's see. Another game can be measured in which the position orientation return to their previous states. The returning motion or reverse motion can be utilized. And the return movement of the designated object, position orientation recorded may be set as a target position orientation, may be changed as the parameters such that the designated object returns. Thus, by causing an object to perform a return movement using a velocity and angular velocity or acceleration and angular acceleration, object can be moved according to a physical or in the virtual space. The time intervals at which position orientations are recorded may correspond to a time frame which is a unit time of display, and the positions and orientation may be stored in memory on a frame-by-frame basis. At each current frame during return movement, the position orientation recorded into memory association with the further previous frame may be set as the target position and orientation, resulting in smooth return movement. Yep, that's Good. So it's pretty much the position orientation recorded into memory at time intervals may correspond to at least the first period of time immediately before. May correspond to at least a first period of time immediately before the time of giving the start instruction. Right. Yeah. Course perform return movement corresponding to the most recent first period of time. Therefore, a motion that tracks backward changes in position and orientation of the object remembered by the user that can be implemented. The game program may cause the computer to further execute. Okay, so you can cancel it. Return movement object will end when the planned movement is completed. It can be stopped according to the user's operation. Okay, so you can stop the rewind midway through. Game program may cause the computer to further execute, disposing the virtual space path, display object indicating the movement path. Time intervals may correspond to a frame, which is unit of display. Game program may cause the computer to further execute based on a selection of start instruction, causing the game to transition from normal mode in which a selection of the designated object is disabled to a selection mode in which a selection of the designated object is enabled, and in the selection mode, rendering an object selectable as a designated object. Display so you can so it's a clear selector. Pointer. Okay, yep. Transitionable state change may be set for each of the objects in advance. The game program may cause the computer to further execute, updating a state in the virtual space based on physical calculation. The state change may include disappearance of the objects. In response to disappearance of the designated objects during the return movement may be ended. Okay. So basically what that's saying is if something spawns, you can make it disappear again. Let's see here. Okay, so this is actually... This is a RAM layout, I think. Wait, what figure was that? Yeah. Okay, so... Again, I'm not going to go too in-depth here, but we do have a lot already to go off of. Like, this is very... This one is almost simpler in a sense because we have basically seen how this functions. Okay, and yeah, so I've also got this here. Process determines whether or not the designated object performing the return movement has collided with another object or character. For example, determines whether or not there is collision with the designated object using the designated data, DC, the player, character data, and the object data. If the designated object performing the return movement has collided with another object or character, the processor proceeds to step S. Meanwhile, the designated object performing the return movement has not collided, it proceeds to step S. So you can actually make stuff collide with yourself, which is potentially very interesting. Like, potentially very, very interesting. What else have we got here? I'm wondering if there's if there is going to be provision for basically preventing the player from forcing themselves to clip through something by smushing themselves with an object, they'll probably just kill Link, to be honest. If he gets crushed. Now that I think of it, that's probably the most sensible thing to do. Unless you can get some kind of brief invincibility frames at the same time. Glitch hunters take note. Not a huge amount else here I think I want to comment on per se. Oh, I don't know. Or, I thought I said or a plurality of objects. Of a plurality. Okay, let's move on to this last one here. So this one has definitely got a lot of people excited. This is the descriptor for Link's new falling mechanics. So you've got your normal falling, and then these arrows here between each of these states indicate how we can transition between each set. So from normal falling, we can go into low velocity falling or diving falling. We can also go back and forth from these. Also can go back and forth from low velocity falling into diving falling. From diving falling, we can go into high velocity falling or backward falling. So those are very, very useful things to know. We can also transition between high velocity and backward falling. So this is a nice little flow chart for what we can expect in terms of that. Then we also, I'm assuming this is our stamina wheel here. And this is a game space. I'm assuming this here is describing a camera movement and how that impacts the my brain. How the movement is impacted basically by the camera. Then we have midair archery again, of course. And how the camera responds to that. Different postures for that and how they can be transitioned between. State A vertically downward, state B downward relative to first reference direction, and upward relative to first reference direction. Upward relative to second reference direction, and downward relative to second reference direction. And again, we have checking whether we're falling, moving to the initial posture, and then adjusting accordingly. I'm thinking a special mode operation, that's going to be the archery. Posture changes from which we can transition through. So let's have a look again at the description for this one. Now, let me see here. So, let's see. Okay, so yeah, it does actually change based on the camera. That's very interesting. According to the configuration of the above, it's possible to reduce risk of an unnatural motion of player character, such as a character posture, such that the posture of the player character frequently changes according to changing direction of the virtual camera. So sort of based on what I can recall of the gameplay footage, behind camera is going to give us, well, I mean, if you're paragliding, I guess, probably not that relevant, but I'm assuming behind when the camera is behind, we'll see a sort of slower fall. Then above is going to be like there, maybe, or sort of a steeper incline, and then sort of directly above is going to be straight down. And presumably, if we look up, then Link will flop onto his back. I don't know if you heard that. Link will flop onto his back. So Let's have a look here. So, in the falling state, controlling the player character such as the posture of the character, the posture of the player character corresponds to at least one of a plurality of types of postures, in which an upward direction of the player character is directed downward in the virtual space, and a posture in which a forward direction of the player is directed downward in the virtual space. In the falling state, controlling at least one of the falling direction and falling velocity according to posture of the player character. According to the above, the posture can be diversified, and player can be moved in the falling direction and falling velocity according to the posture. Shooting action. Player can easily recognize the shooting direction. Here we go. I missed this bit. So, controlling a posture of the player character that is falling based on a character operation performed by the player, controlling a direction of a virtual camera based on camera operation performed by the player, and controlling the position of the virtual camera such that at least the player character is included in the field of view of the virtual camera based on a position. So basically, yeah, the camera is going to control Link's diving posture. Or falling posture, I should say. Let's see here. Where are we? Yeah, posture while falling. So let's check our first figure here, which is figure 8. Now, shown in figure 8, normal falling is a falling state where the character falls with its head upwards in the game space while taking a posture as if standing with arms a little up. When it falls from a height without performing a jumping action described later. Okay. During the normal falling, player cannot perform an operation of moving the player character. That is, during the normal falling, the player character falls downwards according to laws of physics. Okay, so if you just fall off the edge of something, it's basically saying you can't control Link's direction mid-fall. Low velocity falling is played when a character falls in a position hanging from an item which imitates a parachute. The character falls with its head upward, like the normal falling. Falls as if gliding while traveling forward. An exemplary embodiment during the low velocity falling, the player character falls on moving left and rightward. Okay, yeah. So that's fairly normal. We know the paraglider we're familiar with. The player character is falling the position and direction of a virtual camera for generating a game image is changed according to a camera instruction. Rotates in the yaw direction. Virtual camera is controlled. The diving falling state is a state where the player character falls with the forward direction thereof, being directed downward in the game space while taking a posture of stretching its arms and legs outward like skydiving. During that diving falling, falls at a falling velocity lower than that of normal falling and higher than that of the low velocity falling. In the exemplary, the player can transition from the state of normal falling to the state of diving falling as described above. If the player character falls from a height while performing a jumping action, e.g. an action of jumping from the height, the player character first takes position of diving falling. Okay, so if you dive off of something specifically, you will immediately go into that state. Let's see, what else do we have here? Oh, hang on. So What I'm curious about. 206. Is that simply a distinction or... Okay, yeah, here we go. Indicates the stamina gauge. Okay, specifically mentions low velocity falling. That's the only instance where it shows up. Okay, so it's not necessarily going to take stamina to sugar glide, I'll call it, after the sugar glider. So I saw something here as well about the B button. Here we go. Play character in a state of diving, falling, transitions. The play character in the state of diving, falling, transitions to the state of normal falling, according to a diving end instruction by the player, e.g. an input instruction performed by pressing the B button of the right controller. Play character in the state, transitions to the state of low. Okay, so that's basically just saying that we can pull the paraglider out from diving, which I think was in that. Anyway, yep. Okay, so that's pretty normal. Examining embodiment. While the play character is in falling state, the game system turns the virtual camera in the direction the virtual camera is directed upward based on the direction change operation input by the player, e.g. an input for a turn start instruction. So allows the player to easily perform the operation to turn the virtual camera upward, thereby enhancing operability. Here we go. Player character in the state of diving falling transitions to the state of backward falling according to a turn start instruction by the player, e.g. an input instruction performed by pressing the A button on the right controller. So it's an actual button input, and it just swishes the camera around. That makes a lot of sense. So it's not necessarily entirely according to the camera. So if we look at that again, so then presumably we can switch in and out of that. I think I skipped, did I skip over high velocity falling? Diving falling, normal falling, backward falling. It moves up, down, left, or right. High velocity falling. Player character in the state of diving falling transitions to the state of high velocity falling according to a high velocity falling start instruction by the player, e.g. an input instruction performed by pressing the first R button of the right controller. Okay, so they're all going to be fairly... So they're going to be button... It's going to be button based. So... Okay, so if it's button based, then I can see some very, very interesting stuff happening there for certain. And again, if we see anything relating to the direction of the wind in particular as well, I can see some very, very interesting aerial combat happening in this game. Like, without question. And, you know, it makes... And again, as has been said before, it makes sense that Skyward Sword was re-released in light of this in particular, just with the different styles of movement through those areas, and also obviously the setting. But that's definitely... Now, I'm imagining, without sort of looking at it in depth, Okay, yeah. So basically, this is just describing how the game is going to calculate which direction you're going to be aiming. I should check to see if it will allow you to shoot an arrow with a bow while falling. Takes a ready posture. Moreover, performs action shooting arrow according to shooting instructions. Use ends the ready posture. And input instructions that are button. Okay, so these ones that were examples above, they're not necessarily saying that those are the final button mappings, so we may see some changes to that. But yeah, special operation mode, that makes sense. I'm assuming I do wonder whether or not we'll still get the bullet time. I don't see why we wouldn't get the bullet time. So we basically have a fairly in-depth description for the most part of both new and revised mechanics for this. I'll probably need to give this a bit more of a look over more slowly in my own time so I can pick out anything that I've missed, because there's a good chance I've missed a few things. This is not a small these aren't small documents by any stretch of the imagination. Like, there's a lot being described here in terms of the functioning of the game, and I'm sort of just trying to make sense of it on the fly. So it's possible I could have made some errors. But as far as I can see here, we do have a lot to be excited about in terms of new gameplay mechanics and sort of how these can potentially be used both in normal gameplay and in game-breaking gameplay. So I'm very, very interested to see what will be found, especially with these documents in mind, sort of describing the specifics of the internal functioning. I mean, a lot of it probably doesn't add a huge amount to what we could find out from just pure experimentation, but it is nice to have a detailed explanation of how this all functions and, you know, flowcharts and so forth. Also, just as a small aside, before I close off here, well, at least close off this part of it. Where were we here? Ah, yeah, this little patent here I found quite interesting. This appears to be a patent for the most recent Mario Golf game. Just, you know, you can see here, play characters move when hitting a ball, advancing towards next hitting position during movement. The player character interferes with the movement or hitting of the competitive player character according to an operation of a player. So that's interesting as well. I wanted to see if there were any other patents filed around the same time. If you do want to try and have a look and see if you can find any, I was able to find this on Patent Scope on the search by searching for Nintendo.co.ltd storage medium information processing, limiting it specifically to the US offices and sorting by publication date. You'll probably find most of them around about the top of the list. Oh, before I forget as well, so it's very, very interesting. If we look at a lot of these dates here, we can see notice of publication for most of these. Hang on, let me just close these off so I can see this a bit more easily. So if we go to documents on all three of these, I'm pretty sure I have all the different ones open here. If we look at a lot of these initial filing dates, so these were initially, the notice of publication was sent out February of 2021. What I find very, very interesting is the bulk of these were presented in full or near to in full, uploaded near to in full, rather close to the date that the trailer came out. So if we look I'm just going to pull up the trailer here. Let me just drop that in. So, might as well full screen this for the sake of visibility. So obviously, we can see here Link is in his skyward diving pose, and then his paragliding pose. If we look at, there's a couple of other thoughts I had as well. These frames here, where Link is initially using this ability, I'm wondering how much of this is just an animation transition versus using an old animation. Because the Sheikah Slate animation, you have Link sort of holding his hand out like this. That part of it at least can be potentially be reused. Could have been reused. I'm not sure if we'll see some new animations for that. The spatial deformation around this is quite pretty. It's a nice little effect there. Excuse me. Nice little shader effect. And then obviously seeing how this functions. Now this here, I do wonder whether these points that we may find on the map will be what allow us to ignore the height restriction to get up to the islands. Potentially the ones that have fallen down from the sky, maybe where we find these, like the pieces that have fallen down that we can see in some of the trailer footage, like thereabouts. So these may be sort of stepping on points for the islands. And we may sort of see these little carvings on them. Because we've got these sort of concentric circles here, which clearly indicate some kind of marking position. This could, of course, be the receiving of an ability or something similar as well. It's hard to say, to be honest. However, we can also obviously see the process of Link going upward here. Now, it's probably the targeting reticle thing is probably going to be of a sort of similar greenish color there to there, I would imagine. And it makes sense as a navigation mechanism for these sky islands, purely because obviously they're going to be split out over multiple levels from what we can see. And it does also make me wonder, again, sort of how everything fits together in terms of the way the game world will be interacted with. So I guess we shall have to see for a lot of this stuff, because it's, we only have so much at this stage. I do hope that we'll be getting something new soon, because there really is just a great deal that we could potentially look into. Also, looking at this footage from the field again, the fact just the absence of Korok Forest. We can't sort of see it here because of the haze, but I'm fairly sure it's meant to be sort of up here somewhere. Maybe if I'm having some difficulty placing the perspective. I'm also getting quite tired, but it's very, very interesting what we could be seeing overall. And I am waiting with bated breath for the next little snippet from Nintendo, whether it is an intentional one or otherwise. The development of these games has also always fascinated me. Like, not just like the playing through is tremendous fun. Like, I have rarely had bad experiences playing through Zelda games, unless you're counting the only bad experiences have really been related to like my arachnophobia, and Re-Deads are really creepy. Hang had some really weird nightmares about them for a while, but just the same recurring one. But the other aspect about this series that I really, really love is the development, the way that it's approached, the way that that shapes its story, and the way its story shapes its gameplay. Like the two sort of play into each other in a very profound way, just due to the development ideologies of the people behind it. And just looking at the way a lot of these games have evolved with time, again, in recent events, we have the Space World 97 restoration, which I haven't looked at in any great depth myself as yet. Beyond sort of like just looking at it, and seeing what other people have had to say about it. But seeing the development approach from that perspective for Ocarina has been really, really enlightening. If for nothing else, it's made me a lot less hesitant about my own creative processes, because everyone has those first steps when they're designing something new, and Breath of the Wild and this sequel are very much, for the series, in a lot of respects, something very new. And I do hope that we continue to see both the old and the new going forward. Anyway, I have rambled for about an hour at this point, so I am going to call it a night. It is about time I headed off. For all who are watching now as I record this and in the future, thank you so much for sticking around. I'll be uploading this as a video in its entirety to YouTube, and then probably doing a more concise summary of thoughts and a more informed digestion of the patent information. But yeah, thank you so much again. And I hope you're all having a wonderful whatever you're having, whatever time of day it is. Thank you so much. Bye.